sons that were slain for minimal gain. Youth that can't read, speech that can't talk, passion to move, a love that won't walk. I speak to you, my heart and my soul, my family and folks were I should.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Education is the Best Medicine. And thanks for watching. And remember, public access is your best bet. Today is the second in our series with Dr. James Taylor. He's a professor of politics over at USF, which I didn't realize that's my I'm an alumni. I graduated from there in 1999 with a degree in organizational behavior. So we are in good company here. Dr. Taylor, welcome back. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
A little bit about your duties at USF. And you're teaching a couple of classes, I think, and you were talking about religion and politics. Tell us a little bit about that class.
Well, that particular class, I looked mostly at the way in which religion is activated as a political instrument in politics, particularly in the sort of history of Black American people, how religion has been used as a political resource and a resource to mobilize as well. I think if you look at people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, a number of people, you know, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and others, religion, even with Marcus Garvey, has always been, if not at the center, it's certainly been not too far from it in Black people's attempts to find freedom in the United States, whatever that literally means.
A little clarity on that. I've always felt that during slavery, the church was used as a control tool for Africans in America. It had its benefits, and even today we see it as a control tool. To what extent am I right or wrong, or what is your view in terms of historical context?
I think mainly that reflected the period, because if you go back far enough, the original encounter of Black Americans with religion, many of them were Muslims, the Africans that were imported. But you also had amongst Black Americans who were Christians, a strong movement of militancy with David Walker in 1829 with his appeal that inspired Nat Turner in 1831 with his uprising in Virginia, Gabriel Prosper going back even further in the 1800 a rebellion that he attempted, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1821 or so, 1822. So religion had always been a source of, you know, of a mixed bag for Black Americans. In one sense, they used it to sort of narcotize them from the pain of daily life. It was a sort of existential cover to help them not feel the pain of being in the condition that they were in. And on the other hand, there were people like Walker and Nat Turner and a woman named Maria Stewart from Boston who all called for insurrection, called for revolution, because they felt that slavery and other forms of oppression were sin, and that God, if you will, would require them to free both Blacks and whites from the sin of slavery. So it is a mixed bag, but mainly what you're, I think, referring to is in the 1890s on up into the period of Martin Luther King. The Nation of Islam emerges in the 1930s. Their criticism, Malcolm X's criticism, Elijah Muhammad's criticism of the Christian religion and of the Black church in particular for being sort of otherworldly, was mainly a reflective of Booker T. Washington's towering personality that dominated Black politics from 1895 to 1915. So the Black churches reflected Booker T. Washington's personality, as did all of Black politics reflect Booker T. Washington's personality, in the same way that Martin Luther King comes along in the 1960s and single-handedly almost wakes the Black church up to move towards the civil rights movement.
Segue, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois.
Yeah. I think, you know, Booker T. Du Bois himself, in the book The Souls of Black Folk, dedicates the most controversial chapter to that book, and it's called Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. And in that book, he talks about all these militant Christians who are revolutionaries that I just mentioned, including Walker and Turner and Prosser and others. And then he says Booker T. Washington was a traitor of Frederick Douglass's militancy and brought in a whole new type of militancy. So that was the beginning of the break with Booker T. and Du Bois, because Booker T. Was actually Du Bois's boss at Atlanta University, where Booker T used to be president before Tuskegee. And what is a little known fact in history is that there was the first black Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard University was a man named William Monroe Trotter. His father was a wealthy man in Boston. He owned a newspaper called the Boston Guardian. He was a militant. It was he, not so much Du Bois. In popular, sort of academic discourse, people talk about Booker T versus Du Bois. Truth is, Du Bois agreed completely with Booker T. Washington until an incident occurred in Boston where Booker T. Washington went from Georgia up to Boston trying to expand his leadership, the same way that King tries to go from Georgia up into Chicago, up into Harlem to expand his leadership. And when Booker T. went up to Boston, he went to a meeting at Faneuil Hall, which is a famous place in Boston, and actually encountered William Monroe Trotter, this man who was like a pit bull personality, and they got into a public fight. Booker T. Washington and William Monroe Trotter got into a fight, and it resulted in Trotter's being arrested. And then, in turn, out of anger, Du Bois wrote the chapter in the book about Booker Washington, and as a consequence, they parted ways. And now, because they were the most famous of the three, Booker T and Du Bois, as opposed to Trotter, everyone thought the real conflict was between Booker T and Du Bois, but Du Bois agreed with Trotter up until that moment. So it should really be Booker T. Washington versus William Monroe Trotter. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
No, it's interesting too. Interesting periods. Maybe you can give us some discussions. Jim Crow.
Yeah, that's what I think is the tragedy of modern day racial discourse, is that we are quick to say, well, slavery was 140 years ago, and most people today make claims that they had no part or benefit from slavery. But it's clear that there's at least one or two generations that is still alive that suffered the inequalities of Jim Crow. Anyone in their 60s, 70s, my mother's an 80-year-old woman from the South, she told me about her experiences. There are people in their 50s today who suffered down in certain parts under Jim Crow. So Jim Crow, more recently than slavery, also sort of affected negatively the development or the competitiveness of Black Americans in a way that has never been addressed or settled. And so Jim Crow, this system, it's ironic that the same pen, it's a quill pen that the Judge Taney used in 1857 to say that blacks were not citizens and the founders never intended them to. On the night before the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case was decided by the Supreme Court, in which Jim Crow was born, the one person to dissent from that ruling was Judge Harlan. Judge Harlan's wife on that evening took the quill pen that they somehow came into possession of that belonged originally to Judge Taney back in the 1850s. The same pen that said blacks are not citizens. That night, his wife, the judge's wife, left that piece of history that they had on her husband's desk. And that next morning, when he got up, he wrote his dissenting opinion with the same pen. And the dissenting opinion was basically that justice is colorblind, and that segregation was wrong. And that very same opinion of Justice Harlan is what is used by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1954 to overturn Plessy with the Brown versus Board of Education case. So,
I think also that, again, we always talk about these periods in history, but we want to thank you for illuminating them. The period of Reconstruction.
Yeah, the period of Reconstruction, I think, was a sign of hope for American democracy, a true racial democracy. It was about 11 years long, from about 1877 to about 1865 to 1877, from the abolition of slavery until the 1877 Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where the Republicans, which was the party of Lincoln and the party of blacks at that time, basically traded in the White House. They preferred the White House over justice for blacks, and as a result, the President Rutherford B. Hayes agreed with the Democrats of the South to withdraw federal troops from the South and give the South back control over the Negroes in the South. And as a result, the South recovered itself and restored segregation that lasted up until the period of Martin Luther King. So Reconstruction was an interesting moment, but it didn't last more than slightly more than a decade. And Manning Marable, who's I think at Columbia University, refers to the period around Martin Luther King's era and just after as a second Reconstruction. And it too seems to have been stillborn, because we imagine that we have arrived in America in terms of social justice and equality. Even yesterday, we found that there was, in the election in which the Democrats finally took over the House and the Senate, that in Michigan, there was a proposition in the state of Michigan that limited affirmative action. And
by our good friend Ward Conley.
Our good friend Ward Connolly. And yet we see that, affirmative action works effectively for Black Americans in the American prison system. No one complains about that sort of preferential treatment, but people complain about so-called preferential treatment in the wider society. And it's interesting that we are at a time when, you have a prison industry where you have about 2 million Americans in America's prison, and more than 1 million of them are African Americans. Now that tells you something. There are 30 million Black people in America. 1 million of them are in prison. There are 300 million other Americans. Out of the other 300 million Americans, they have the same number as the small cohort of Black Americans do. So 30 million Black people, 300 million whites, they both, and Latinos in between, they both make up the 2 million people in America's prisons. The bottom line is that Blacks are overrepresented in the American prison system. And I think it goes back to all sorts of experiences that Black people have had in American society.
Lynching.
Yeah, Ida B. Wells, I think she did an excellent job in exposing the fact that lynchings have more to do with uppity, progressive, educated Black people like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who were business owners, and not marauding boogeymen Blacks who are around raping white women. Ida B. Wells did comprehensive analysis that demonstrated that rape was very rarely the accusation. In fact, Orlando Patterson, who's at Harvard, wrote a book recently called The Ordeal of Integration and Rituals of Blood. And in that book, Rituals of Blood, he talks about the fact that lynchings more often than not coincided with murder, manslaughter on the part of Blacks than rape. But the myth was that it was Black male rape that resulted in lynching. And the truth is, throughout 400 years of slavery, there were no records of Black people being lynched. As soon as slavery is over, suddenly you have 40 years of lynchings. Now, the question is, why didn't we have any lynchings during slavery? I think it had to do with the feeling, the trauma that whites felt of losing control in the South over their Black property. And that trauma, I think, sent them off into all sorts of vigilante violence that targeted Black males, mainly because they were now competitive laborers in the marketplace as opposed to rapists. That was just a myth. It was called the new Negro crime, but somehow the Negro didn't commit this crime under slavery. And I think it had more to do with social control. They were controlled under slavery. You don't need to lynch them. But once you lose control of them, the lynching is another way to traumatize Black Americans into submission in the marketplace and in the labor market.
Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm.
The movie Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, President Woodrow Wilson, in the White House of the United States, the first place it was ever shown, W.D. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, was shown in the White House. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, a former Princeton University president and professor of political science himself and a racist. Woodrow Wilson himself actually invited Griffith and a whole bunch of racists into the White House to celebrate this film. And as recently as 1996 or 1998, the American Film Academy, or whatever the major academies that recognize films, actually considered The Birth of a Nation one of the top 50 most important films in American history. Not so much because of its content, but more because of its importance historically as the first motion picture film. But that says something to America, that its first depiction of motion pictures was a celebration of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was shortly thereafter that Booker T. Washington and Andrew Carnegie and others converge around this whole question of segregation and Jim Crow.
As you kind of look at how politics has been used in American society to control Africans in America. What are some of the significant decisions that you feel really said and discussed the level of not only fear but control of us as a community?
Yeah, I think when you look back, I think when you look at the arrangement, the political system itself, the structure itself, actually traded in on black subjugation. It's not like the founding fathers when they created this incredible system, and it is, compared to all of the other systems, a very young country, is a very young system and a very young experiment in democracy, but it was only able to operate and function as long as blacks were put in a certain position in relation to other groups in society. I'd love to talk more about Native Americans and Mexican people, Chicano people historically, because their stories are important too. But I think it's important. There's a book by Lani Guinier, who's at Harvard Law School. She and her colleague Torres wrote a book called The Miner's Canary. And they use this as a metaphor about the birds, the canaries, who go into coal mines that coal miners use. They send these birds into the mines because they have very fragile respiratory systems. And these birds would go in, and if the birds died or didn't come out healthy, then the miners knew not to go in because the whole environment was toxic. And they use that as a metaphor to talk about American society. That if you look at the black predicament, the black, in essence, predicament is equal to that canary. And if you look at what's happening to black America, the prisons, the educational system, when you look at the breakdown of marriage in black American life, which is a crisis beyond what we talk about in public. Black people's social sort of location in society, independent of black progress since the civil rights movement, is largely toxic. And like the analogy that if the bird is dying for the miners because of its fragile system and the toxic condition, then Lani Guinier and her colleague Torres say that black America should be read in the same way. That if you look at if what's wrong with black America is what is wrong with America. So the prison system is not just about black America. It speaks more to the American system and its need to outsource employment, to outsource jobs around the globe, and yet to have at home a captive, cheap labor where you can get someone to work for Victoria's Secrets for 17 cents an hour who has a felony and is in, let's say, Corcoran, and then when they get out of Corcoran, if they go to Victoria's Secret for a job, that might pay them $10 with benefits, they can't get a job with Victoria's Secrets because they have a felony. But they were good enough with a felony inside in the prison, working for 17 cents an hour. And when you look at Katrina, I think Hurricane Katrina is a updating writ large for America, not for black America, for America to see how sick and toxic the environment is.
And wanted you also to talk about, because it's one of your areas of study, the prison system, particularly as it relates to African Americans. We understand there are more African Americans in prison than there are in college. The cost of housing and warehousing these men can run anywhere between $30,000 and $40,000. What used to be educational environments where they could get degrees and training no longer exist, and they're just being warehoused. Now, in some states like California, they want to outsource prisoners out to other facilities when they've built those institutions in the state already, but cannot open them up because they can't get enough individuals to run them. Tell us a little bit about your...
I think that has a lot to do with, for example, a place like Tehachapi, and other places that are in these marginal outskirts of California and throughout America, where jobs have been outsourced and the manufacturing-based economy has sort of been sent abroad for cheap labor. And so in America now you have these places that used to be industrial workers and manufacturing workers.
Blue collar.
Now they no longer have work to do because that work has been outsourced. So what do? You find another industry. And Ike Eisenhower, as he left the White House, talked about the military-industrial complex. And more recently, scholars like Angela Davis and others have begun to talk about the prison-industrial complex, or the prison industry, where black labor and Latino labor and poor white labor, cheap labor, are held captive for the purpose of, as you say, divvying out and bartering out workers for all kinds of industries. It's a quasi-slavery in America that is acceptable in American society because of our belief that people who are in prison are all guilty and deserve to be in prison. Now, many people in prison deserve to be in prison, and many people in prison are guilty, but there are causes and there are effects. And we are willing to look at the effect and talk about people who are in prison and ignore the conditions that foster the breakdown of families, that foster poor education, that foster poor health care, and as a consequence lead to all sorts of desperate acts that lead to crime and then have them incarcerated.
And I think you bring up a point that I think that we've always tried to hammer home here, is that the minimization of individuals, either by economic, social, political, allows those individuals to be utilized or used for any and everything, and thereby their self-esteem and worth in the community are phased. And it's just not something that people wake up and do. It's a mindset, and it's a particular system is in place to make it oppressive, from incarceration to lack of jobs to lack of issues of food, clothing, shelter, we always say here. So I think that you're really clear about the fact that we have to look at this as not just a particular group's problem. We have to look at it as a societal problem and more of a reflection of what the culture needs to be moving out of as opposed to into. Speaking of that, what are some of your solutions? What do you think are some of the things that can address, for example, the prison system? We hear about them, and we talk about them, but maybe from your ideas as a
I know this is symbolic, and many people may not respect or appreciate this, but I think that if there was a national apology for slavery, not so much in the form of reparations or anything like that necessarily, although I'm open to that, and John Conyers has a bill, H.R. 40, that is being considered in the city of San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, Los Angeles, Detroit, the state of Iowa, and the state of California have all recently, in the past few years, and Chicago especially, have passed these slavery disclosure ordinances. That's a whole other conversation. But I think they're on their way to understanding, even in the 21st century, the psychological harm that slavery has done to African American people. And so I think when you begin to sort of start there, one of the solutions, I think, is to apologize. The Australian government apologized to their Aborigine for taking their children from their families for 70 years because they called them a doomed race. The Catholic Church apologized to Israel and Jews for their part in the Holocaust, historical Holocaust, not just German Holocaust. Throughout the world, people have tried to reconcile their histories. And I think if America, and it almost did when Clinton, with John Hope Franklin's Commission on Race, almost apologized for slavery, but because of the power of the Southern Bloc of Democrats and Republicans, he was not able to. But I think an apology for slavery would at least release America from the burden of this racial history and help us truly to move forward into the 21st century. If I victimize you, and then next time I see you, say, "Hey, George, how you doing, man? What's going on?" and you still got blood hanging all down your face from my victimizing you, there's no way you and I can sit and have a civil conversation or that we can ever heal. I've got to recognize what I've done wrong before we can heal. In America, even with the Emancipation Proclamation, even with 600,000 people dying in 4 years, has never said sorry. And that would go a long way. In addition to that, and related to that, I think if we found more corrective programs, like in the 1970s, the California correction system removed the word rehabilitation out of its title. And just recently, under Schwarzenegger, it implemented putting rehabilitation back as a goal. There are resources here in Oakland and in the Bay Area generally that help people. But I think if we had a system that was less committed to sort of, law and order, just punishment, and tried to come up with a system that allows people to confront their actions. I think they had a really recent show on, I hate to cite this, but I have no other choice. Oprah Winfrey had a show recently where the victimizers were forced to confront their victims. And I've not experienced anything more powerful than witnessing men have to tell their victims and the family members of their victims what occurred up to the moment of the death, to answer questions like, what was the last word of my mother? See, I think that would heal both those who perpetuate crime and those who are the victims of crime. And I think in American society, we have such a sense of us versus them, black versus white. It is they who commit these crimes, not our social problem. So it makes it easy for America never to try to heal people who, for example, in the prison system, continue to come out and recidivate and go back and commit the same crimes. And the real tragedy in Black America and in Latino America is that they tend to be the main victims of the violence that is affecting the communities.
We got about a minute to go. In about 30 seconds, final words.
Okay. Now, I just want to say that I'm glad that you give me this opportunity to talk. I hope that somebody's listened. I hope that people understand that there are real problems in American society that need to be addressed. I think America has the potential, again, to be a wonderful country, but we definitely need to be honest with ourselves and deal with our real history as opposed to whitewashing it with niceties that really only perpetuate our real problems.
How do we get a hold of you?
At the University of San Francisco, I can be emailed at taylorj@usfca.edu. I'm not going to give my home number out.
We don't we want to be able to maintain some right here.
I can be reached at the University of San Francisco.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on,
Yes.
Dr. James Taylor.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for bringing light to a very, very dark world. And if vision is the art of seeing things yet unseen, then truly you are a visionary.
Thank you,
and we wish you success
Thank
in
you,
all the things you do. We want to partner with you.
Yes.
Once you come back on
Thank
and,
you.
give us some more knowledge.
Definitely.
Right?
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Doc. Thanks,
For
Doc.
sure, for
All right.
sure.
Cool. Yeah, good stuff.
In the world, y'all check it. For mamas broken hearted, I surely came. Sons that were slain for minimal gain. Youth that can't read, speech that can't talk. Passion to move, a love that won't walk. I speak to you, my heart and my soul. My family and folks, what I surely owe. My 100 double O, nigga, ride a flow to the beat, here we go. And it's so. I was born in the city of dope. If you survive with the live, gotta pray to cope. When the players pop the collars on the fade stroke. 76 keys of F3, I'm ready to go.
I tried it. It didn't work for me, but I didn't realize that I wasn't doing well in school because I was bored. I had seen that commercial. I called,